Welcome, wanderer of stories. Tonight we travel to the banks of the Nile, where gods walked among men, and where betrayal, devotion, and resurrection shaped the destiny of an empire. This is the myth of Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus, a tale not only of gods, but of love and envy, of justice and vengeance, of chaos that can never be destroyed, an order that always finds a way to return. Sit with me now as the torches of the temple flicker, and let us remember how Egypt's most enduring story was first told. Before dynasties rose and fell, before pyramids pierced the sky, the people of the Nile gathered at nightfall to hear the stories that bound their world together. Among them, none was greater, none more enduring than the tale of Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus. This was not merely a story of gods ruling from far off heavens. No, it was a story woven into the very heartbeat of Egypt, a story of the black land and the red, of the fertile flood and the barren desert, of order and chaos locked in eternal struggle. They told of Osiris, a user, the green god, the king who brought fertility to the Nile, life to the crops, and justice to the throne. They told of Isis, a Set, the goddess of magic and devotion, whose love was so fierce it could call life back from death itself. They told of Seth, Set, the storm and the desert, the brother who could not endure another's light, and so betrayed blood for envy. And they told of Horus, Heru, the falcon-eyed, avenger, born of sorrow and destined to restore the balance. This tale was not carved into stone as a single ending, but lived in the voices of priests and the whispers of farmers, carried on the floodwaters, told beneath star-choked skies. It was a tale of murder and resurrection, of betrayal and justice, of chaos exiled and order reborn. And so we begin, with a kingdom in mourning, a god slain, a widow in rags who would not surrender, and a child, yet unborn, whose eyes would one day pierce both storm and shadow. The tale begins. Perhaps the most important story ever whispered along the banks of the Nile is the tale of Osiris. His name carried more than the weight of a god. He was a user, the king of Kemet, lord of green fields and flowing waters, the ruler of the fertile flood that turned barren desert into life to the people of Egypt. He was not distant divinity, but the very rhythm of the Nile, the living promise that death could give way to rebirth. At his side was a Set, Isis, she who knew the hidden words of power, mistress of magic, of devotion, of cunning intelligence. She was both wife and queen, mother and sorceress, the balance to his order, the one who bound the kingdom with both tenderness and strategy. Together they reigned not through fear, but through harmony. Their rule was steady as the river's eternal rise and fall. Yet even in the house of the gods, envy can find a doorway. Osiris' own brother watched with eyes dark as the desert storms. His name was Set, Seth to the Greeks, lord of barren lands, of thunder, of wild and untamed force. He could not endure the radiance that followed Osiris wherever he walked, nor the love the people bore him. In every field that bloomed, in every song sung to the harvest, Set heard his own absence. He was the red land while Osiris was the black, the desert while Osiris was the flood, chaos while Osiris was order. And so jealousy curdled into hatred, hatred sharpened into treachery, and treachery became the first murder written into myth. For it was Set who rose against his brother, not in open battle, but with cunning, deceit, weaving a plot that would plunge Kemet into mourning and alter the balance of the universe itself. The Egyptians spoke of their gods in many names, for names were not just labels but vessels of power. To the priests, a user was Osiris, lord of the fertile Nile, the green life that rose when the floods receded. His name was intoned in hymns carved into stone and whispered into fields of grain, because to speak his name was to invoke renewal. A Seth, whom the Greeks later called Isis, was more than a queen. She was the enchantress, the mother, the mourner who defied death itself. Her name carried the promise of hidden knowledge, of spells that bound the very air, of devotion that could overcome the grave. Set, the Red Lord, was Seth, his name as harsh as desert winds. He was both necessary and feared, for he embodied storms, drought, and violence. His very name cracked like thunder across the sands, a reminder that chaos is never far away. And then came their son, Horus, falcon-eyed Horus, whose name belonged to the sky itself. To speak his name was to imagine wings spread wide above the earth, the gaze that sees all from the heavens, the eternal struggle of the avenger who rises when order has been broken. These names, though altered by Greek tongues and softened by time, still carry the full gravity of their myth. They are not just sounds but archetypes, echoes of eternal struggles written into the fabric of human memory. Order against chaos, loyalty against betrayal, life against the grave. Each name is a mask, each mask a story, and every story a reflection of truths older than kings and empires. The priests of Heliopolis, city of the sun, told the story by firelight. They spoke in hushed tones, for what had transpired was no ordinary tragedy. It was a wound to the balance of the cosmos itself. All of Kemet sank into mourning, for the death of a god was not the loss of a single life, but the shattering of order. The rhythm of Nile and sky faltered, and the world held its breath. Once, Seth had been a protector. He stood at the prow of Ai's great solar barb, striking fiercely against the serpent Apep, that endless coil of chaos rising each night from the abyss. His spear was fire, his strength a shield against annihilation. He was storm, but storm with purpose, the necessary wildness that defended creation. But envy corrodes even the strongest hearts, driven by jealousy and fury. Seth abandoned his station. He no longer fought chaos. He became chaos in shadows. He wove his treachery. The tale says he lured his brother Osiris to a banquet, a feast dressed in laughter, gilded with wine, where trust made Osiris blind to danger. There Seth unveiled a coffin, crafted with cunning, carved to fit his brother's body with cruel perfection. In jest he coaxed him to lie within, and when Osiris did, the trap was sprung. The lid was sealed, the bolts hammered down. The laughter died into silence. They cast the coffin into the sacred river, and the waters carried away the king of life. Some say this was the end, but darker whispers spread that Seth was not content with drowning, that he tore his brother's body apart, hacking it into fragments, scattering the limbs along the Nile as if to erase not only his life, but his very memory. And so Egypt wept, its ruler lost to the deep, its goddess queen bereft, and the cosmos itself trembling at the betrayal. For when a god dies, the order of the world unravels, and in that unraveling, chaos waits to reign. When Osiris was lost, all of Egypt mourned. The air hung heavy with silence, and even the Nile seemed to flow more slowly, as if in grief. Yet in that desolation, Seth did not collapse into despair. She veiled her divine light, wrapped herself in ragged clothes, and fled into the western hills, walking among mortals as one of them. To the unknowing eye, she was but a widow, tired and worn, but to those who looked closer, her eyes still carried the fire of eternity, for though her heart was broken, she was not finished. Visions stirred within her dreams, visions whispered by the gods who pitied her sorrow. They told her that hope was not dead, that Osiris could live on, not in body, but through a son who would rise as the heir of Egypt, carrying both vengeance and renewal in his blood. It was then that she came to the temple of Heliopolis, where a humble priest named Amos kept his vigil, though she stood before him clothed as a beggar. And Moses' heart recognized her. He saw through the veil and fell to his knees, and in hushed, urgent tones, Seth revealed her secret. Gather for me the scattered pieces of Osiris' broken body. Collect every fragment, every bone, every echo of him torn apart by Seth's cruelty. Bring them together, for through sacred rites and my magic I shall weave him whole, and from that union, denied to us in life, shall be born a son. He will be Egypt's rightful king. He will be my vengeance and the world's renewal. Her words trembled not with doubt, but with unyielding resolve. She was not merely mourning, she was plotting resurrection. Amos hesitated, knowing the danger. My lady, he whispered, Seth hunts you even now. To gather these pieces will risk the lives of many. But Seth's gaze did not falter. Risk we must, for the balance of the world tilts, and only through this son can it be restored. And so the priest bowed, agreeing to her command. From that moment, the search began. Across the marshes, along the Nile's endless bends, through temples and hidden groves, piece by piece, the fragments of Osiris were drawn back to her, carried in secrecy, guarded with devotion, and in the quiet shadows of exile, Seth prepared the rites that would defy death itself. The priest obeyed, and so began the most sacred search in the history of Kemet. Piece by piece, the scattered remains of Euessa were gathered from the marshes, from the banks of the Nile, from fields where farmers whispered prayers as they unearthed fragments of divinity. Each fragment was wrapped, guarded, and carried in silence, as if the weight of the cosmos pressed upon those who bore them. When at last they were brought together, Seth prepared her rites. With chants older than dynasties, she wove spell upon spell, not only to restore the form of her husband, but to bridge the distance between life and death in her lament. Grief became power in her devotion. Sorrow became flame. Through her incantations she called Osiris back, not to walk the earth again as king, but to give her one final gift, a child who would avenge him and heal the balance of the world. Thus was conceived Heru, the falcon born in secrecy, hidden from Seth's watchful eyes. He was nursed in shadows and cradled in the reeds of the delta. From the moment he drew breath, his body carried the strength of his father and the wisdom of his mother. His eyes gleamed with unearthly sight, sharp as the falcon's, able to see what others could not. His heart beat with the rhythm of vengeance and justice entwined, and though he was only a child, those who looked upon him whispered that destiny itself had taken form. For in Heru lived the promise that Osiris would not be forgotten, that chaos would not prevail, and that Egypt would one day see order restored beneath the wings of the falcon. But Seth was not idle. Crowned in the chaos he himself had sown, he ruled as tyrant. The fertile fields of Kemet grew heavy with fear instead of grain. In every village, whispers spread like smoke. The rightful king was gone, and the usurper's shadow stretched across both black land and red. Yet destiny cannot be silenced. When Heru came of age, the falcon's son rose from secrecy and declared his challenge. No longer a child hidden among reeds, he stood tall, eyes sharp with divine sight. His cry rang across the two lands, and the Nile itself seemed to swell with the echo. Uncle, I will not yield. The throne is mine. The battles that followed shook Egypt like thunder over desert rock. The people watched as order and chaos collided, God against God, nephew against uncle. Their clashes shattered temples, roared across the floodplains, and seemed to make even the heavens tremble. One contest was remembered above all, the two agreed to meet not on land, but beneath the waters, where the Nile was both cradle and grave. They transformed into hippopotami, colossal beasts of muscle and fury, vanishing beneath the river's dark surface. For days they fought in silence, their blows sending ripples across the current, their roars vibrating in the deep from the sky. Set could not watch idly. Desperate to protect her son, she hurled harpoons of divine flame into the water, but grief and haste clouded her aim, and the first spear struck Harry himself. He broke the surface, crying out in pain, "Mother, you wound me. Take care, for it is I who fights for your honor." Her heart cracked with anguish. She wept, torn between her fury at Set and her terror for her child. Again and again she steadied her hand, until at last a harpoon struck true, lodging in Set's hide. Wounded, he thrashed and burst from the waters, blood staining the river red, and then, with the cunning that always hid beneath his strength, Set fell to his knees and begged, "Sister, have mercy. Spare your brother who once stood with you upon the sunbark. Do not let me fall to death at your hands." And though vengeance burned in her heart, Set's nature was mercy, even for the betrayer, even for the murderer of her beloved. She could not deny compassion. She stayed her hand, leaving Set broken but alive. It was this act, mercy in the face of vengeance, that would wound her son more deeply than any spear. For Harry saw in her pity not wisdom, but weakness, and his fury at her choice would one day erupt in violence darker than even Set's betrayal. That Hera's heart burned hotter than the desert winds, where Set saw mercy. He saw betrayal, a weakness that allowed his father's killer to breathe another day. His blood roared with the rage of youth, the cry of vengeance unfulfilled, and in that fury he turned not upon his uncle, but upon his mother. With a single stroke, blinded by wrath, he struck Set down, severing her head from her body. The earth itself seemed to shudder at the violence. Silence fell across the two lands, heavier than any storm. For what crime had she committed, save compassion? And what son wounds the very womb that bore him? Yet death is not always final among the gods. The cry of her last rose to the heavens, and I, Lord of the Sun, beheld the scene with sorrow and stern judgment. He descended, carrying light where only grief remained. With his hands of flame, he restored Set, returning her head and giving her a crown of divine protection, radiant and unbreakable, so that never again could harm of this kind befall her. And though she had suffered the hand of her own son, Set forgave him. She saw not only his rage, but the wounded boy within, a child who had lost his father, who had borne the weight of vengeance since birth, and whose heart was poisoned by the endless war against his uncle. She pressed her hand upon his cheek and whispered her forgiveness, even as her crown still glowed with eyes' eternal fire. But the wound was deeper than flesh, deeper even than forgiveness could mend. Trust between mother and son had been fractured. The bond of mercy and vengeance now stood in conflict, and so the strife between Heru and Set only deepened. For now it was no longer a battle between nephew and uncle, but between mercy and wrath, order and chaos, written into the very bloodline of the gods. The war raged on, unceasing as the Nile's flow. Each clash between nephew and uncle seemed to tear open the very sky, and yet neither could claim final victory. For Heru was young, fierce, and driven by justice, while Set was cunning, ancient, and born of chaos itself. In one moment of treachery, Set struck his nephew with a cruel hand and stole his eyes, plunging the falcon god into darkness. No sun, no moon, no stars remained to him, only blackness, as though Abeb himself had swallowed the sky. The world was silenced for Horus, and the people of Kemet wept, for what ruler could rise blind into the throne of the two lands? But even in despair, wisdom finds a path. From the shadows came Tehuti, Thuth, the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, lord of knowledge, keeper of hidden arts, with words older than stone, with spells sharper than any spear. He fashioned new eyes for Horus. They were not merely replacements, but gifts of vision unlike any the world had seen. Eyes of moonlight and sunlight, eyes that pierced veils of shadow, eyes that saw both the near and the far, the visible and the unseen. When Heru opened them once more, his gaze was sharper than the falcon's flight. He could see through deception, through distance, through the very fabric of illusion. And so the war did not end. It blazed even fiercer. Time and again he fought his uncle, rising like a storm across the two lands. And time and again, when victory wavered, Set's cunning tipped the scales. Her disguises, her spells, her whispered tricks of divine magic turned the tide, ensuring that the son of Osiris would not fall. The battles shook the earth, but the story was far from over, for vengeance and justice had yet to be fully weighed by the council of the gods. At last, the quarrel could not be contained. The battles had shaken the two lands long enough, and the gods themselves grew weary of watching nephew and uncle tear at one another. So the matter was brought before the Ennead, the great council of gods, a circle older than dynasties, whose voices carried the authority of the cosmos itself. It was Set who demanded judgment. Loud with outrage and swollen with pride, he cried out for the throne of Egypt to be confirmed as his by divine decree, and the council, uneasy with his fury, agreed to hear his case. Yet one rule was made clear: Set was forbidden to attend, for too often her cunning words and subtle magics had tilted the balance in favor of her son. But Set was not one to be silenced. Disguise was her weapon, and cleverness her crown. She cloaked herself in the guise of an old crone, stooped and weary, and made her way to the river crossing. There the ferryman guarded passage to the island of the middle ground, where the council waited, with a golden ring pressed into his palm. She purchased silence, and so he ferried her across the sacred waters. When she came before the gathering, she had shed the crone's form and appeared instead as a young maiden, radiant and sorrowful. Set, blinded by vanity, did not see his sister, only beauty. She served wine, moved among the gods with grace, and when at last she drew near her brother, she spoke with trembling voice. "My lord, a stranger has come into my house. He killed my husband, robbed my son of his birthright, and cast me into grief. What judgment would you pass on such a man?" Set, full of self-righteousness and eager to impress, thundered his answer before the council. He should be condemned. He should be stripped of all he has taken and banished from the land. And in that instant, the maiden's veil fell away. The gods gasped, for it was Set standing there, her eyes bright with triumph. Her words rang like a blade. "Then, hear your own judgment, brother. For my husband was a usurper, my son is Heru, and the thief, the murderer, the usurper is you." A hush swept the chamber. Set's own words had condemned him. The council turned against him, not because they were swayed by Isis's grief, but because truth had slipped past his guard and been spoken from his own lips. Rage consumed him. He cried out for vengeance, demanded punishment for the ferryman who had carried his sister across. Yet no rage could undo what had been revealed. The gods had heard, the world had seen, and from that day the balance tipped against him. The banishment of Set and the rise of Heru, raging with humiliation. Set turned his fury upon the ferryman, the humble soul who had carried Set across the river. With cruelty befitting chaos, he cut off the man's toes, thinking to erase his disobedience with pain. But such vengeance was hollow. No punishment, no violence, No storm of wrath could undo what had already been spoken before the council of gods. His fate was sealed, not by Isis's cunning alone, but by his own words, his own pride. For while Seth raged, Horus had risen, no longer the hidden child of the marshes, no longer the boy struck down and blinded. He now stood as falcon, with eyes blazing like the twin fires of sun and moon. His wings stretched wide over Kemet, a symbol of renewal and rightful order restored. With the strength of his father Osiris and the wisdom of his mother Isis, he confronted his uncle once more. The battles shook the earth, but this time the end was certain. Justice moved with him. The falcon's talon struck, swift and unyielding, and chaos faltered. Horus triumphed. The throne of Kemet was his, not by cunning, not by force alone, but by destiny that could not be broken. As for Seth, he was banished to the deserts, driven into the barren wastes where sandstorms howl and the fertile Nile gives no life. There, in the Red Lands, he would dwell, not destroyed, for chaos cannot be destroyed, but exiled, bound to roam the edges of the world forever. His name lived on in storms and in terror, but never again upon the throne. And so, order was restored. Osiris descended into the underworld, crowned as Lord of the Dead, Judge of souls. Horus reigned over the living, his falcon eyes ever watchful, and Seth endured as mother, queen, and goddess of magic, the thread that bound them all. Thus the tale ends as it always must, with balance. For in the myth of Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus, the Egyptians found not only the story of gods, but the eternal rhythm of life itself. Death and rebirth, betrayal and justice, chaos and order, forever locked in the dance of the two lands. The eternal balance, and Osiris, though slain by his brother's hand, did not vanish into nothingness, for gods do not simply die. They transform. He descended into Duat, the shadowed underworld, where the river of souls winds like a mirror of the Nile. There he was enthroned not as a victim, but as a king, becoming lord of the dead and judge of all who passed beyond the veil. In his hall, hearts were weighed against the feather of Mart, truth itself, and the fate of mortals was decided. Thus the balance was restored. Horus ruled the living, falcon-eyed protector of the two lands, seated on the throne of Kemet as the rightful heir of his father. Osiris reigned in the land of the departed, his presence ensuring that even death had order, that the journey beyond life was not chaos but judgment. Between them stretched the rhythm of eternity, day and night, life and death, Nile and desert, order and disorder. Isis remained eternal, ever the mother, ever the magician. Her tears for her slain husband watered the earth, her spells guarded her son, her cunning held chaos at bay. She was grief and power entwined, the thread without which the fabric of the world would unravel. And Seth, though cast out, was not erased. He was bound to the Red Lands, the barren deserts beyond the fertile Nile. There he roamed, restless, raging as storm and sand, his voice the howl of the desert wind. For chaos cannot be destroyed, it can only be banished, held to the edges, kept in exile, but never silenced. In every storm, in every drought, the people still felt his presence. So the myth closes as it began, not with victory alone, but with balance, life and death, light and shadow, mercy and wrath. The tale of Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus is more than myth. It is the memory of Egypt itself, written in stars, in sand, and in the eternal rise and fall of the Nile. The enduring tale, so the myth endures, carved into temple walls and whispered in prayers carried on incense smoke. It is a story older than empires, yet alive in every grain of sand and every ripple of the Nile. A tale of murder and resurrection, betrayal and justice. A tale that shows even gods are not immune to envy, grief and love, that they too can bleed, mourn, and hope as men do. It is the story of Osiris, the king who died and yet was never gone, of Isis, whose devotion and cunning bound the world back together when it threatened to unravel, of Horus, the falcon who rose to avenge and to rule, his eyes blazing with the promise of order restored, and of Seth, chaos incarnate, who though cast into the desert, remains as storm and shadow. For chaos cannot be destroyed, only banished. This tale reminds us that even in the heart of chaos, order can rise again, that even when life is torn apart, renewal waits in the silence of death, that in every ending there is the seed of a new beginning. For this is not only the myth of Egypt's gods, it is the rhythm of existence itself, to fall, to be broken, to be reborn, and so, generation after generation, as the Nile rises and recedes, as temples crumble and sands shift, the story continues, not as relic, but as truth, not as memory, but as mirror, for the myth of Osiris is the myth of us all, the eternal promise that in every death, some form of life is always reborn. And so, wanderer of stories, we leave the banks of the Nile and the shadows of the temples where this tale has lived for thousands of years. The myth of Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Horus is not only carved in stone, but carried in the silence of every rising sun and every flood that renews the land. These were not just gods of Egypt, they are eternal archetypes, reflections of the struggles within us all. Osiris, the part of us that seeks renewal through loss. Isis, the part that loves so deeply it can conjure life from death. Horus, the falcon-eyed self that rises to face injustice, even when the battle feels endless. And Seth, the shadow within, chaos, envy, fury, that can never be erased, only exiled to the edges of our being. To hear this myth is to be reminded that life itself is a balance of chaos and order, betrayal and justice, death and rebirth, and though temples fall and dynasties crumble, the story endures, because it is the story of existence itself. So tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the falcon rising into the morning sky, his wings cutting through storm and silence alike. Imagine Osiris, seated in a duet, weighing the hearts of the dead. Imagine Isis, eternal and watchful, whispering her magic into the world. And know that within you, too, these gods live, their struggle, their love, their eternal return. For the myth of Osiris is not just Egypt's memory, it is the memory of us all. And so the myth of Osiris endures, carved in temples, whispered in prayers, carried on the eternal flood of the Nile. In it we find not just the struggle of gods, but the rhythm of our own lives, betrayal and loyalty, chaos and order, death and rebirth. For Osiris did not vanish, he reigns as Lord of the dead. Horus rules the living, falcon-eyed and watchful. Isis remains eternal mother, keeper of devotion and magic, and Seth lingers still, in every storm and every desert wind, a reminder that chaos can never be erased, only exiled. So when you look at the rising sun, or listen to the river's flow, remember this is not only Egypt's story, it is the story of us all, to fall, to be broken, and to rise again. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, may the balance of the two lands live within you.